following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
To see an organization recognize that, hey, this is not going to push out a bunch of tweets about the graph, or it's not going to bring on, new applications specifically to the graph, but it's going to support the quality of the community as a whole and the diversity of the community as a whole, was so meaningful for me. And really just, I think, sets an incredible example for other organizations across the sector.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time, lost between past and future.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Anne Conley and Chief Nimwoya, Wave 4 grant recipients and authors of the new graphic novel titled Trust, a story about the power of blockchain technology and how it can save a community and transform the future. During this interview, I talked to Anne and Chief about how they first became interested in blockchain and Web3, their experience applying for and receiving a Graph Foundation grant, and why they came together to write this graphic novel, Trust. As you will hear throughout the interview, both Anne and Chief are well accomplished on their own accord. And once again, you'll find that the story of how they met and came together to write this novel is, once again, a story about how Web3 is impacting Africa. I started the discussion by asking Anne and Chief to introduce themselves.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. My name is Anne Connolly. I've been in the crypto space for about a decade now. And before crypto, I worked in humanitarian aid. So I was running medical humanitarian projects in Central Africa mostly. And one of the reasons that I got so excited about crypto was in that role, I used to carry knapsacks full of money to be able to pay our staff in some of the unbanked locations. So when I learned about Bitcoin, I thought, hey, this sounds pretty great. I think we could solve a lot of problems with this technology. And so ever since, I've been very passionate about applications of blockchain technology for emerging economies and social impact. And I spend a lot of my time working on the education side. So I teach a course on blockchain-based business models for social impact at Boston University. I teach the decentralization of societies at Singularity University, and do a lot of talks about the impact of NFTs through Every Realm Academy as well. So thanks for having me today.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Chief Nimwoya. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. I have been working in animation, graphic novels, comics, and writing for over a decade. I'm the creative director of Freehand Studios, which is a studio here in Nairobi. And I learned about blockchain when I met Anne. That was about in 2016. We were together at Singularity University doing a program there. And she somehow managed to find ways of addressing so many different challenges, different global challenges from, governance to water and so many things. And I was just, confused and fascinated, like, what is this blockchain thing that can be a silver bullet? And I was skeptical at first, but, I started to read up a bit more, and she approached me in, I think, 2019 about the possibility of doing an education book about this. And, I found it very interesting, and it's been one of the most interesting books I've worked on so far.
Well, Anne and Chief, we're going to talk a lot about your grant work, and that's part of the reason we're talking today. You were both awarded a grant from the Graph Foundation for some really interesting work that's going to educate the next generation about blockchain and what it can do for them. But I want to travel back in time a little bit, explore how you two met, get a little bit more about that story. But before we do, Anne, I want to ask you this question about what was the light bulb moment for you as it relates to blockchain and crypto, and how it could make an impact in the world. Can you take us back to that moment?
I think when I'm Canadian, and for a lot of North Americans, when they first learn about Bitcoin, they just, get it. They're like, why would I want this? I already go to the store, I buy milk and bread, I use my credit card, things work really well. And so for me, having lived in countries, I spent 7 months in rural Central African Republic. And that's a place where not only is there essentially zero banking infrastructure, but the currency itself isn't even owned by the country. It's owned by France, and they control it, and they control what happens to it. And so, having spent a fair amount of time living and working in a location where there was functionally no financial system, for me, I remember thinking when I read about Bitcoin for the first time, just like, this is going to be so transformative for, the 4 billion unbanked and underbanked populations around the world. And that was it. I couldn't look back. You just couldn't look at the world the way it was before ever again. And so I've been very excited and passionate about this technology ever since.
Chief and Ann, this is a theme that's come up on the podcast multiple times. And so I want to give you both the opportunity to address it. And it is what Ann just said there, which is a lot of people in the United States, as an example, they don't really grasp or understand the impact of crypto and potentially even blockchain in the world. Because as Ann said there, you can go get a bank account, you can keep your money in the bank, you can transact at the store. But in some cases, the inflation of just keeping your money in a bank account in some other countries is terrible. It's a terrible choice. You lose a lot of the value. So do you agree that in more developed economies like the United States, they might be slow or last to adopt something that is so impactful to so many others throughout the world?
Yeah, I mean, for me in Kenya, the most painful thing is the bureaucracy, the dysfunctionality of government registries. If we're talking about the land registry, companies registry, persons registry, these places are overstaffed with a clerical staff. Essentially what they're doing is making entries to ledgers. And, the process can take years. Like, for example, we made a change to our company, adding more directors to the company, and it's been over 18 months and the entry still has not been made. And every day in this bureaucracies, you have people showing up to work, wearing neckties, looking very serious, but, stuff is not moving. So something like this would be really effective in terms of, just bypassing inefficiencies and, for lack of a better word, corruption, that chokes up systems. Obviously, that presents a political challenge, that because you still need some human involvement to implement these systems, and that's why we were using the story to try and explore, like, how do you get over these hurdles? What are the type of obstacles that you would face? And the story format was the best way of exploring these real world challenges. I think the challenges in Kenya would be a bit different than in Central African Republic, because we do have quite advanced mobile banking. We were one of the earlier countries to adopt mobile banking, with M-Pesa. We are not strangers to digital currency, and it has one of the higher rates of adoption of crypto in Africa. But still, especially in the realm of government, we have a lot of issues that blockchain would be really important for, and it's mostly in those registries.
Well, in follow-up to that, I want to ask this question specific to Africa then. And for listeners, they know that a lot of graph advocates that are currently working with the Graph Advocates DAO are coming out of Africa. We've got Grafrica, the community of the graph in Africa. And now we're shining this really bright light on the work that you two are contributing. It seems to me in a lot of ways that Africa could eventually, potentially here, I guess, lead the world on this.
Absolutely. Like, there's some incredible innovation coming from, particularly looking at Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria. The growth of crypto adoption in Nigeria is one of the greatest in the world. We've seen some really incredible projects. There's one called Live out of Nairobi, where they're doing decentralized energy structures. I think this is what I love so much about the African continent and the community there, is that there's so much talent. And I know that if we can get education to a broader audience, we'll be able to tap into that for the projects to come in the future.
Yeah, just working on this project has exposed me to so many projects that I didn't know existed, from the one that you described, Anne, to the different teams in Nigeria. It's been an education for me as well. It's been like a PhD, I would say, in learning who's out there and who's doing what.
And I want to ask you this question about reconciling two parts of the story of blockchain and crypto itself, which is the real utility, which we're going to talk a lot about today, and which was what the light bulb moment for you was, and then the speculative nature of it. How do you reconcile that? You probably see the headlines, you see all the different things going on in the crypto space that belongs to that speculation bucket, but in your heart, and I believe what's probably driving your passion, is the underlying utility. How do you reconcile it?
Yeah, really, people, I had an interview with the BBC probably a month ago when, markets had tanked and my portfolio, I think, was down 80%. And she says, are you worried? And I couldn't stop laughing. I was like, no, not at all. Like this, the price doesn't matter. It's really about what are we building? What systems are we breaking? How are we impacting people around the world? And so for me, it's not about trading. It's not about how much is Bitcoin worth. It's how many people have wallets now. What's the adoption rate? And I think the industry as a whole needs to really move away from this number worship around price points and really start to look at number worship of like, how many people have we onboarded? How have we made it easier for people to do that? How have we looked outside of our, Western European, North American mindsets and thought, okay, how can we include more people around the globe to do that? And so for me, there's no reconciliation needed. It's all about what are we building and what's the impact. But I think we need more of that culture across the space.
All right. So, Chief, you mentioned this a little bit in your introduction, but let's go back in time to when you two met. Give us the context of how you met and how you eventually came to start working together.
Wow. So I applied in 2015-16 to go to Singularity University, and it was like a Hail Mary. I wasn't sure I would make it, but luckily I did. And it was just about 70 of us, really amazing program. It was sponsored by Google, and they brought 70 people from around the world, really interesting people in many different disciplines. And I was the only one who was in entertainment, I think, in graphic novels and comics. And for me, it was really mind blowing. It was a real eye opener. My exposure to technology was mostly through animation, using computers in animation and doing this type of thing. And I was interested in VR a little bit, but I never thought about blockchain. I'd never heard about blockchain before. And, it took me a really long time. It was a very steep learning curve, but eventually I kind of caught on to what this thing is. This thing is essentially a way of removing all the layers of abstraction that have made representative democracy not work. Because we hire a bunch of people who we think are capable among us, and we send them off to some distant central location to make decisions on our behalf, and it doesn't work. From something as simple as hiring men to decide on reproductive health on women, things which they're not affected by. So there are many ways, even from a civic perspective, in which we are unhappy with the way things work. So my antenna were up for something that could make a difference. And I think blockchain was one of the most potent solutions that I heard of, not just from Anne. There was also another group from Argentina. I forget what her name, Pia Mancini, who talked about, decentralized democracy. And all of these ideas were very exciting for me. And you'll notice even in the book, we don't emphasize very much cryptocurrencies because I see that as very secondary. The same way you would, for example, at the graph. I don't know how central the price of graph is versus what capabilities graph brings as being a kind of, how do you describe it? A Google for the blockchain. That's really what's exciting. The fluctuations of price, it's like, I don't know, we need to move away from that. Even with the traditional stock market, you don't want to evaluate your company based on what the current stock price is. You want to evaluate, based on what your product is doing and what the quality of your product is.
So one of the things I love about Singularity University, which is where Chief and I met, was that their whole vision is how do you solve problems that impact 1 billion people or more using exponential technologies. So technologies like AI, blockchain, nanotech, food tech, all these sorts of things, and really look at, in tomorrow's world, a billionaire is going to be not a person who has $1 billion, but a person who impacts the lives of 1 billion people. And so their whole mantra was, how can we bring all these experts together who have expertise in a variety of different technologies, a variety of different life experiences and problem spaces, and put them all together to see what they can come up with. And so Chief and I, went to all kinds of incredible sessions from different people and had different experiences. But really what was most incredible that came out of it was the network. And so, initially we didn't work on anything together, but fast forward 3 years and just thought, hey, this could be a great collaboration between a blockchain expert and a graphic artist and an incredible storyteller. And that's how we came to create the Trust Project.
So we're going to get to the book and the grant here in a minute. But before we do, I want to lay some more foundation for listeners, which is, how do you think about the difference between blockchain, crypto, and Web3? Maybe I'll give each of you a chance to just kind of help me understand how you think about the difference between these three things: Web3, blockchain, and crypto.
Absolutely. So for me, Web3 is the big umbrella. It's how do we take societies from being based upon these centralized models, whether we're using governments or corporations or other organizations to collaborate and perform transactions, and how do we move to more decentralized models? And so blockchain very much enables this and underpins it and makes it possible, but it's not the only technology that can work. It's not the only way to make Web3 happen. And then subsequently, the same sort of thing, as you move downwards to cryptocurrencies, they're a foundational element of blockchain. And I think some people try to separate them maybe more than they should. But, I think the key thing around cryptocurrencies is really understanding that, it's blockchain that is creating these foundational changes. The crypto is great. It enables a lot of things. It's going to create change, but it's blockchain that's fundamentally going to break apart our societal structures and rebuild them in completely new ways.
I think Anne did fantastically well. Much of what I know about blockchain, I learned from her. I will maybe just say that for me, what is attractive about it is not its novelty, because it's not necessarily a new technology. I think it was just the convergence of different factors, maybe, computational speeds that made it happen when it happened. And for me, what it is just a disruption of really calcified governance structures and financial systems. We have a real problem with financial inclusion here, where banks only lend to a very thin strata of our society. Someone like myself with a very substantial amount of banking, relative to the rest of the population, I'm still ineligible for many banking services. I still, have to submit excess paperwork for something as simple as a credit card. So the financial system is not very inclusive. So it's very ripe for disruption. And Nairobi, Kenya has been a real fertile ground for fintech and for financial innovation. And I think it's one of the ways in which we can come out from under the structures that are not serving us. And the need is really great here, as Anne had alluded to, much more than in a place where states are good things when they work. We look at examples like Scandinavia or Canada, but when you're not in a very functional system, when bureaucracy fails and the state is non-responsive, then you start to see the viability of alternatives. And there's a reason why there's so much adoption happening here. People are looking for ways out of oppressive systems.
And how should people think about what blockchain is? And again, we're early days here. This is a new technology with the power or potential to disrupt a lot of things in the world. But a lot of people still don't fully understand it. Sometimes the context is that it's a ledger. Sometimes it's been discussed on this podcast as a trustless computer. Where do you come in on this? How do you describe or think through what blockchain is?
I like to think about it just as a record of transactions, and that's it. So if you imagine every transaction that happens every day between people and stores and banks and governments and corporations, if all of those transactions were stored in one place, that's kind of like a blockchain. But what's cool about it is that, a copy of that chain is stored on thousands of computers all over the world. And so if I wanted to hack into one of those transactions and change it, not only would I have to do that on, the one place I want to do it, I'd have to do it on those thousands of computers all over the world. And so it essentially creates a single source of truth for everyone, across the globe, which is exciting. So I think that's how I like to think about it. It's just all the transactions we make in any given day stored in one record, but copies stored all over the place. So it's harder to hack.
So, Chief, based on Anne's great explanation of how she thinks about what blockchain is, why is something like that going to be helpful to people in a place like Africa? Why is that a better solution than what exists today?
So what exists today, and I can speak specifically about Kenya, what exists today is duplication of records in a place like the lands registry. So you have a lot of cases of fraud where on the same parcel of land, there can be multiple titles. And then you spend years in litigation trying to find out who has the legitimate title. There's a lot of delays when it comes to updating records in, companies registry, persons registry, something as simple as a birth certificate. I know all of the things I'm talking about from personal experience, not hearsay. Something as simple as my birth certificate, which I required in order to get married. I had to spend over 7 months verifying details, running in between different government offices. There was no integration of records. And admittedly, there are other ways of doing this using centralized databases. But I think centralized databases are more vulnerable if they're attacked or for whatever reason. And then even if you think about, something burning down or there's a lot more vulnerability when you put everything in one place. I can think of many other use cases. Medical records, for example. I would ideally like to live in a situation where if I could move across a border without any documents or anything, just with my secret 12 letters, I can just get access to the same information anywhere I go and not have to depend on systems. Really, you really see blockchain shine when you cannot rely on institutions. And more, I think people are realizing that in different parts of the world.
Okay, Ann and Chief. So let's now turn our attention to the grant that you applied for with the Graph Foundation and start with kind of how did you learn about the Graph Foundation's grants program and what inspired you to apply?
So I ran into the Graph team at East Denver, which is one of my favorite events every year, and just had such a great conversation about them with what they're working on, what they're doing, and felt there would be a good connection there in terms of what we're doing and how we can help build out, foundational ecosystems of developers and that sort of thing who would then, go onwards to work on projects like the Graph. And so we applied and we had a really excellent experience working with that team. Just really felt that, for a project like ours, which isn't Graph specific, we're blockchain and project agnostic, the team really understood the need for that and the need for foundational education that grows the pie of crypto users and blockchain developers and entrepreneurs, even though it doesn't specifically promote one particular project. And to me, that was such an incredible feeling to be able to work with a team that understands how important that is to the entire ecosystem to invest in a project like ours that's going to help everyone as opposed to just helping one project. So we were thrilled with our experience with the team.
And we've been stringing listeners along for a minute here, but I'd love now to dive into this project. So, Chief, what is it exactly that you've been working on with Ann that was behind the foundation grant that you received?
So Trust graphic novel is a story about a young woman and her quest to defend her homeland from basically being taken over by an oligarch in Central City, in a central land. And basically, it's an innovative way of telling the story of blockchain and its impact without actually, doing it in an academic approach. You do it by actually showing it being used in action. And we thought this was a really interesting way of doing it.
So, Ann, this is a story then. This is a graphic novel that tells the story of a hero and tries to explain then the fundamental nature of blockchain and the impact it can have?
Absolutely. Our number one goal is to reach 1 million new young Africans who can learn about blockchain in a fun way through a fun story. And we're doing that in sort of 3 ways. So one is a graphic novel that Chief was talking about. And then we're also doing a motion comic that I think will be very shareable on Instagram and Facebook. And then we're doing an NFT collection as well, just to highlight some of Chief's incredible art and get that out into the space. So really what we want to do is just take people from 0 to 1, give them, a couple of easy use cases. What is blockchain? Help them kind of get inspired about this technology. And then we've actually partnered with about 10 different educational partners across Africa who are doing more in-depth blockchain training. And so we really want our readers, when they get to the end of the book or the end of the motion comic, and say, hey, what next? And then we've got them, this path forward where they can connect with partners in Rwanda or Kenya or South Africa or Nigeria. We've got a number of them to go onward to get more in-depth training to be able to join this community.
So as you're working together and collaborating on this book and building this story, when you're envisioning the reader, take us into your mind. Who did you hope would read this story, and what did you hope they would do after reading it?
So the reader that we had in mind was somebody who is obviously young, curious, coming into the world, coming into their own, but doesn't necessarily know anything about blockchain. So this would be their first introduction. This would be, possibly the first time they're hearing the word blockchain. And, as Anne said, getting them from 0 to 1, from not having any knowledge to having an understanding of what this technology is, what its potential impact is on, and 1 or 2 use cases. And then from there, we direct them to all the different resources, such as our education partners, and they can be able to learn more for themselves. So our whole thing was just to inspire them the way we ourselves have been inspired through stories to learn about different technologies.
And when you met with the team in East Denver and you talked to them about what you were working on, where were you in this phase, by the way? Were you in the ideation phase? Were you already writing the story and coming up with some of Chief's illustrations?
I think we were partway through at that stage. It took us a long time to kind of get things kicked off. So, one of the interesting things about the blockchain space is because it moves so quickly. For us, when we started in 2019, the space was very different than it is today. And so, by the time we were connecting with Graph, like DAOs were now a big thing, and they weren't a big thing when we started. And so we're like, hey, this is so good. We have to put this into the story. So there was a lot of kind of agile story writing, let's call it, and agile animation as we were building this book, because there were so many great new elements that we were able to incorporate. And so I think at the point when we connected with the Graph, we had a rough storyline and had inked out, storyboards for a good proportion of the book, but we're also in the process of sort of changing some things and updating it based on what was going on in the space, which is pretty exciting.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. As many of you long-term listeners know, there are a lot of interesting themes starting to emerge from all the guests who have been on this podcast. For instance, a theme you're hearing again in today's episode is how Web3 and blockchain technology are creating change and opportunity in Africa. And this is the whole point, right? Despite all the noise on social media or the salacious headlines in mainstream media or the actions of a few bad actors, Web3 is changing the lives of real people all over the world, and it might be even changing yours. Every innovation ever introduced in the world has followed its own adoption curve. These types of things, especially the ones that introduce lots of change, take time. But it's the underlying utility and impact on the people who use the technology that ultimately drives its adoption. And I don't know about you, but the stories coming out of Africa, shared by people like Anne and Chief, make me excited and hopeful for the future. Not just about the adoption of Web3, but for mankind. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for your support.
Would you be willing to take us behind the scenes a little bit and describe what the process is for writing a book like this?
I think I've lost a lot of hair over the last 3 years and probably lost a lot of weight. As Anne said, when you're doing agile storytelling, there are some trade-offs, and the biggest trade-off is on time. So I hope that Anne, you and I will remain good friends long after the publication of this book. Because, we were supposed to have released maybe a year earlier than we did. But as she said, all these new elements kept on coming, and, DAOs weren't a thing. But then, toward the end of the project, DAOs became a thing, and, there were so many different approaches. Yeah, but traditionally, you start off with a concept. It can be very rough. You have a few things that you'd like to see in there, maybe a few locations, a character who you like. You do a few sketches of them, try and flesh it out. And then once you have that, you develop a story, that would suit this character. And, you put them into a situation and you try and create the world in which they will act and which will act on them. And once you have the story, then you make storyboards, and you make the storyboards. The whole purpose of the storyboards is to be able to edit quickly on the fly without a lot of investment. So it's a storyboard is basically scribbles, quick scribbles, and I would share those with Anne, and Anne and I had to be corresponding weekly, so we had weekly calls. At first it was once every 2 weeks, and then when things got more intense, we started doing once every week. So we'd have calls like this, discuss, how much progress have you made on the art, and she would also tell me, like, you should maybe take this direction instead of this. This is not a plausible use of the technology. This is more plausible. And in the process, I was also learning. So the journey that you see the main character going through kind of mirrors the journey that I went through. And I also would have suggestions about, what would be a good use given this context. And we took the decision to use a fictional country rather than actually pin it down to a real country, because Africa is so diverse. Like we were talking about earlier, Central African Republic is so different from Kenya, and Kenya is so different from South Africa, and South Africa is so different than Nigeria. So we had to kind of create a situation which kind of fuses some of the elements that you'd see in different parts. And we consciously took the decision not to emphasize so much, the use of crypto, although there is the use of crypto at some point in the story without giving any spoilers. But we wanted to, as she said, give a more broad introduction to the technology. And just other things are just old-fashioned tricks of storytelling, good characters, a good plot, a good amount of action, and just something that keeps people on the edge of their seat, not knowing what comes on the other side of the page.
So this was the first time I'd worked on a creative project like this. And so I learned so much from Chief about the entire process, but particularly on the motion comic side. So once with the book, we'd finished, the general idea and the storyline and the script, and then Chief had done the storyboards and we started inking real illustrations. The animation team actually took those illustrations and started doing what's called an animatic, which is like a rough version of animation so that they can work out some of the kinks before they do the full process. And then getting, voice actors on board to voice these characters, and finally seeing, the characters come to life, these women, and that, Mora, our hero, like putting a voice to her and having these emotional connection to this character now that she's animated. And so for me, it was a really exciting thing to learn about and understand, especially coming from such a technical industry to do something so creative.
Is it difficult to take something that's so technical and make it into a story that young people would understand and engage with?
Yes.
I imagine so. How did you do it? Patience,
listening to Anne, and just being a good student. I think the whole point of storytelling is to... What stories do really well is set up philosophical conflict. And with blockchain, the basic philosophical conflict that you have is the conflict between centralization and decentralization. And you can attach characters to both of those philosophical positions, and there are arguments for both of those positions. So what stories do really well is explore those philosophical conflicts in a way that is not academic, in a way that does not require you to make citations and, turn to the back of the book, etc. You really engage. You do it through identifying with characters and watching the characters go through that conflict. And the really good thing about doing both the animation and the motion comic together was that even the way I did the illustrations knowing that they were going to be used for animation. So it took a bit longer than it would have if I was just doing a graphic novel strictly. But I think it also shortened the amount of time that would have been taken for animation. So I did all my illustrations in layers, basically separating backgrounds from characters and, making all the elements movable so that the team could work. And, we have a really good team. I would be remiss if I did not shout out the Freehand Studios team, my wife and partner Sarah, and all the other people who spent a lot of sleepless nights and who are still also working hard on the translations and other elements. There's been a lot of Herculean effort.
So without giving any spoilers away, who can tell us what this story is about and what readers will find when they acquire the book?
Yeah, so the story is about Mora. Mora is our protagonist. She's our hero, and she's an activist. She's somebody with a lot of integrity. Does not want to. Our main city is a kind of Gotham-like city that's ruled by a very powerful oligarch by the name Max. And Max has a vice-like grip on the city because he has tentacles all over the government. And it's all centralized in him and his company. And he knows he has the attorney general on speed dial, the president on speed dial, and he's a very formidable enemy. And when she ends up with information that could risk his position, the only people that can help her are in a place called Wahengaland. And Wahengaland is the only part of the country that has stayed outside of the grip of Central City. It's like the Decentraland, if you want to think about it like that. And it becomes the incubator for the technology that she will need to defeat Max.
One of the important things for us with creating this story and including the blockchain elements, we wanted to make sure readers could relate the technology to their lives and the problems that they have in their lives. And so we actually took a lot of cues from Chief's own life and the challenges that he's had or his friends have had to say, okay, this is a real problem on the ground. How can we look at blockchain applications that might help fix this? And so that's our goal really, is that, once the reader finishes the book, they can see themselves in that story and then subsequently, hopefully, see themselves using the technology to help solve some of these issues.
Anne, there's that famous adage, right? If you can explain something complicated, something like blockchain to a young person, you probably now understand it yourself. Did you find that to be true? Did you find going through this experience of trying to explain blockchain in a story that young people would be interested in helped you better understand and sort out this technology?
Yeah, I think one of the key things for us was that because it's such a technical thing to explain, by weaving it through a story and doing more showing than telling, that enabled us to, not only make it clear for the reader, but solidify for ourselves what the technology is and why it matters, and how people are using it in their daily lives and in sort of real life use cases. And so I think, in terms of education, you can, share as many descriptions of distributed ledgers as you want, but until someone can see what that looks like for themselves and with a real life example, I think it's hard for them to absorb. So for us, it was really about how do we do that? How can we show them what blockchain is as opposed to tell them?
If I can just add to that, I would say that the challenge from a storytelling perspective was that how do you accomplish this without losing your audience, without them drifting off and not paying attention. And so I had to try and take inspiration from other people or other films and stories that have done something similar. I think a really good example is like The Big Short, which does quite a good explanation of subprime mortgages and the financial crisis, all in like a 3-minute montage. And, so there were a lot of trade-offs that we had to make. So we just had to make trade-offs, like what are the key messages that you can pass that will be enough to actually communicate this thing without, turning it into a thesis. So yeah, for sure, 100%. If you don't understand it, there's no way you're going to explain to a 3-year-old. And a lot of the time when people don't understand things, they try and hide that lack of understanding with jargon and verbiage. And yeah.
Chief, I want to go back to something you said there about the elements of storytelling. Why is story, narrative, heroes, and villains a great way to tell or teach people about something like blockchain?
Yeah, I think story is the oldest way that we have of imparting information to the new generation and to new people that we meet, and it will continue to be very important in our human existence. And it's by far the easiest way of transmitting information beyond the academic format.
Is this book intended only for a younger African audience?
When I wrote this story, I had in mind an African audience, a young audience like myself, who grew up without seeing themselves represented in popular fiction. And it's something that you would take for granted in any other part of the world where, you grow up seeing your heroes and your stories. And, unfortunately, there wasn't that much funding. And that's what motivated me myself to become a storyteller, because I wanted to see our stories being told. And there were so many from my grandparents and, my elders that weren't making it into popular formats like graphic novels and animation. And when I started making them, the next thing I realized was the challenge with funding storytelling. And crypto and blockchain, and especially with this project, has been some of the least strings attached and frustrating modes of funding that are found. So I really appreciated that. And I really appreciated the Graph in particular for helping us get this out and for still helping us get the word out about this story.
This book is specifically made, by Chief, who's an African storyteller, for an African audience. I think it's really important that people have stories written by their own communities for their communities. And that's what's happened here. This is very much an African project for African communities, but we know that people around the world are also going to love this story. It's very universal in terms of the struggle of communities against, strong centralized powers and how this technology is going to help them with that fight. So we encourage everybody to have a read, and we think you're really going to like it.
Well, Anne and Chief, I've got to imagine there's this huge catharsis, this release of emotion to be done. It's got to be extremely satisfying to finish this project and the next step of this.
It's been so rewarding working on this and seeing it launch. Yeah, it's incredible. And we really want to thank the Graph Foundation for their support on this. We really couldn't have done it without, the donation and from across our other sponsors as well. This really was a community-driven initiative for the benefit of the community. So thank you. Thank you for everything. We appreciate it.
Yes. On behalf of Trust Graphic Novel, Freehand Studios, and all the team that worked on the motion comic and graphic novel, we sincerely thank the Graph Foundation for helping us, midwife this thing and bring it to life. It's been very rewarding.
So, Anne and Chief, you've both been involved in the industry for a while now, and you've been working on this very interesting project, and so excited for you and congratulate both of you and the team for producing something that I think will have a really long-term impact and invite a lot of people into this space. But there's this interesting behind the scenes story here that I want to ask you, which is you're spending your time on this mission, this passion to help young people understand blockchain. And you're at ETH Denver. You run into the Graph, probably know a little bit about what the Graph is, what it does. Then you get a grant. You learn more about the blockchain, teaching people about it. And the entity funding this is this protocol that helps people query and pull data off of blockchain. Did you come to appreciate more what the Graph is intending to do with blockchain by virtue of going through this whole story and experience?
Absolutely. I mean, in some ways, there's this incredible parallel between, the idea of a blockchain as a source of knowledge and a book as a source of knowledge. And if you, needed to go page by page through our graphic novel to find this one piece of information that you needed and you had to do it manually, it would take forever. Same thing with the blockchain. And so I think as the industry scales and as there's more interoperability, there's more applications, there's more data, being able to sift through that and categorize and query and index is not only going to be important, but is going to be actually critical to, the functionality of everything in this decentralized world. And so I've been really impressed by what the Graph is doing. While it is sort of a bit back end and technical versus maybe some of your more NFT type projects that are a little more public facing, I think it's probably one of the most important projects that's out there in the space right now.
Chief, what do you think it says about the Graph funding a project like yours? You're agnostic to blockchain. You don't really even mention the Graph in the story, but here is the Graph Foundation funding your work. What does it say about the Graph ecosystem and community?
Actually, I would make a small correction. We do have a small cameo of the Graph in there. If you're very keen, there's an Easter egg that has a bit of the Graph. But anyway, I think the Graph is involved with Decentraland, is it not?
Yep, Decentraland is an application that uses the Graph.
And one of the biggest use cases in Trust is the use of land titles and figuring out how we can get land titles on the blockchain. And I think something like Decentraland is a really good way to simulate that. And if it can work in that virtual setting, there's no great difference between, making it work there and making it work in real life. It's the same. You're dealing with information, you're dealing with ledgers. And the rest just becomes a political problem. What is really attractive to me, just seeing the missionary zeal that people have and the passion that people have. Of course, there's the speculative side and people wanting to make money. That will be there in every place that you look at. But there is also that real passion that people wanting to see a different way of doing things, people wanting to see a different world, a more decentralized world that brings power closer to individuals and doesn't abstract it away. And even when I listen to speakers at the Graph conferences speaking, That was very clear. People were aware of the political ramifications of what they were doing. And I found that very attractive.
One of the things that was so meaningful for me was that, this foundation was willing and very keen to support a project that didn't directly support themselves. It supported inclusion within the community. It supported education. It supported youth-focused content or, Black individuals in, I would say, underserved markets. And I mean, underserved by the crypto community. We're not hosting conferences there. We're not, pushing a lot of content that way. And so to see an organization recognize that, hey, this is not going to push out a bunch of tweets about the graph, or it's not going to bring on, new applications specifically to the graph, but it's going to support the quality of the community as a whole and the diversity of the community as a whole, was so meaningful for me. And really just, I think, sets an incredible example for other organizations across the sector.
Well, I want to ask you both just one final question here, and then we're going to have the opportunity to do the GRT IQ 10 with two guests. I've never done it before, so that's going to be a lot of fun. But the final question is, what is the next big milepost that you're watching for to kind of signal greater adoption and use of blockchain in the world? But as you look out, read the news or look in the communities or just watch it in your own work, what are you watching for? What's the next big milepost? We'll start with you, Anne.
So we've already seen 2 countries now adopt cryptocurrency. But I think for me, it's less about are we getting bigger and bigger institutions on board? It's when is that moment when I will never again be asked, what can I buy with it? It's that moment when it's so ubiquitous and everyone accepts it, and it, replaces the USD as sort of the de facto global currency, USD or the euro. And it just becomes something that everybody has. And so I think we're still a few years away from that, but that's what I'm hoping for, again, because it's really about how do you touch the lives of so many people and make it functional for them.
How about you, Chief?
For me, the moment I'm looking forward to is seeing it impacting governance in Africa and seeing it impacting, our lives in a material way. As Anne alluded, we live in a part of the world that's been neglected by financial services in general. We pay more for virtually everything, from financial transactions, people sending money back to their families from like the US to Kenya with Western Union. And we really do pay. The people who can least afford to be paying are the ones who are paying the most. So it's hard to say one thing, but it would be nice to see it being implemented in government registries, and actually, having it being recognized as legal tender, of course.
So, Anne, if listeners want to purchase this book and take a look at it, what's the best way to get a hold of it?
So this book is going to be available absolutely free. You can find it on trustgraphicnovel.com. We're going to be pushing it out, as well as the motion comic, on Facebook and Instagram. So you can look for Freehand Studios on Instagram, or on Twitter, we're at Trust Graphic. And we'll be pushing out on the Kindle platform. We'll have PDFs you can download, lots of different formats. So again, trustgraphicnovel.com is the best place to take a look for it.
And for listeners, you can find all that information in the show notes. So I encourage you to take a look at the show notes and get access to this book. And if you know a young person that wants to learn more about blockchain and be inspired by a fun and engaging story, you should definitely take a look. So visit the show notes. And it's remarkable. This is free and available to people. So I got to assume accessibility was a big point in this project and make it available to everybody.
Absolutely. Accessibility was really number one for us. We wanted to make sure that anyone who wanted to read the book could. So because of grants that we've gotten from across the space, including from the Graph Foundation, that's made that possible, that the book can be free. We've also made it available on multiple platforms. It'll be, you can read it on our website. You can download it chapter by chapter if you want to get copies on Wi-Fi. You can grab it on Kindle. And then, of course, the motion comic will go across social media. So I think that accessibility is going to help us reach our goal of getting 1 million new people into this space.
Now we've reached the time. I'm going to ask you the GRT IQ 10. So this is a segment of each podcast interview I do where I ask each week's guest the same 10 questions, hoping that listeners might learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their life. So, are you ready for the GRT IQ 10?
We're ready.
The GRT IQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
And let's start with you. What book or articles had the most impact on your life?
I read this really interesting article called The Nuclear Family Was Wrong. That essentially goes into how this sort of 2-parent, 3-kid household model is actually a very broken one. So I would recommend having a read of that.
Chief?
Yeah, I would recommend Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. And it's basically, he was not writing it for blockchain, but basically outlines all the bureaucratic problems that, we hope to eradicate with such a technology.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you think everybody should be required to watch?
I'm super into documentaries, so I like 3 Identical Strangers, which gets into adoption and some challenges around that.
Wow, I don't know about recommending for everybody, but currently I'm really into a Netflix series called Country Queen, which is about my country. And it's very similar to Trust graphic novel in that there's a villain called Max, and they're trying to exploit a rural part of the country that is rich in gold, and it's about all those intrigues. And we are not so accustomed to seeing ourselves reflected in popular fiction, so it's very exciting when it happens.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
There's this amazing Canadian indie band called The Wooden Sky, and their album, If I Don't Come Home, You'll Know I'm Gone, would be my go-to.
Just the Band's 82. They're a Kenyan band. They released this, when was this? About 2008. Yeah.
What's the best advice that's ever been given to you?
Don't take life advice from someone whose life you wouldn't want.
The best life advice I got came from my older brother. Simplicity is the art of complexity.
What's the one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned yet?
I learned recently that a group of porcupines is called a prickle.
If you walk around the bushes with a flashlight, the highlights are usually chameleons. I learned that from a nature-loving friend of mine. So I do that even tonight when I walk back home from the studio. I'm going to flash my light, and you see so many more chameleons than you'd see otherwise. I don't know if that would work in Canada, but it works here.
And what's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Every night at the end of my workday, I make a Post-it note with the 3 things that I want to achieve the next day. So when I wake up in the morning and I'm tired and grumpy, I don't have to stumble around on what I'm working on. It's right there in front of me.
Yeah, best life hack I've learned is teams. You can't accomplish anything without teams. And Trust graphic novel is a classic case in point. I would be lost without all the unseen people here.
Based on your own life experience and observations, what habit or characteristic do you think best explains people finding success in life?
It's grit. Passion is great, but it's going to disappear over time, and it's not necessarily going to get you through the hard times. It's absolute determination that's going to get you to success.
I would say creativity and an openness to being surprised, because if you're going to do something that's really innovative, that's not been done before, then you yourself are by definition unqualified to do it because it's not been done before. So yeah, and also don't take qualifications too seriously.
Well, Anna Chief, we've reached the final 3 here, and these are complete the sentence type questions. And so again, starting with you, Anne, complete the sentence. The thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
Breaking society and rebuilding it from scratch.
Destroying bureaucracy.
And the next one, if you're on Twitter, then you should be following
Kevin Owaki from Gitcoin.
Wandia Njoya, who is a great iconoclast in Kenya, in education and many other things.
And the last one, I'm happiest when?
I'm with my crypto people.
I'm happiest when I'm drawing or painting.
The GRT IQ 10.
After this,
I show you how deep the rabbit hole.
Anna Chief, I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous. If listeners want to follow you and learn more about the work that you're doing, what's the best way to stay in touch? Chief, we'll start with you.
My handle across all platforms is at Chief Nyamoya. Chief Nyamoya is ChiefNyamoya. NYAMWEYA. I'm most active on Instagram for obvious reasons as a visual artist. So I'm at Chief Nyamoya on Instagram, but also follow Freehand Studios. Freehand Studios KE. That's the name of the studio that's done the motion comic and graphic novel.
And for myself, you can find me on Twitter at Ann_Connolly or at www.annconnolly.ca.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRT IQ Podcast.